On the night of May 1st, 2011, in the quiet, fortified town of Abbottabad, Pakistan, one of the most significant military operations of modern history was about to unfold. For nearly a decade, the United States had pursued its most elusive target, Osama bin Laden, the mastermind behind the September 11th attacks. After years of intelligence gathering, uncertainty and high-stakes deliberations, the order was finally given. SEAL Team 6 would launch a covert raid on a suspicious compound where bin Laden was believed to be hiding. This is the story of Operation Neptune Spear, told minute by minute as one of the world's most notorious figures was brought to justice. Osama bin Laden had been at the top of the FBI's most wanted list for nearly a decade. As the leader of Al-Qaeda, he orchestrated a series of deadly attacks, including the 1998 US embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania, the 2000 USS Cole bombing, and the devastating 9/11 attacks that killed nearly 3,000 people. His ability to evade capture for years turned him into an almost mythical figure, a symbol of defiance against the West. The US intelligence community had been tracking bin Laden relentlessly since 2001. Following the invasion of Afghanistan, he vanished into the mountainous tribal regions, eluding capture through a network of loyal supporters and remote hideouts. Early attempts to pinpoint his location proved frustrating, with numerous dead-end leads and false intelligence reports. Yet behind the scenes, the CIA continued its search, analyzing intercepted communications, questioning detainees, and mapping out Al-Qaeda's inner workings. By 2010, a critical breakthrough emerged. A trusted courier named Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti was identified as a key link to bin Laden. Surveillance of al-Kuwaiti led intelligence officials to an unusual fortified compound in Abbottabad, a quiet military town just a few miles from the Pakistani capital, Islamabad. Unlike surrounding homes, this compound had no telephone lines, no internet connection, and unusually high security walls topped with barbed wire. It became clear that whoever lived there did not want to be found. CIA analysts pored over satellite imagery and infrared scans, monitoring daily activity within the compound. Garbage was burned instead of being collected, adding to the secrecy. The residents rarely ventured outside, and a particularly tall figure was seen walking in the courtyard at irregular times, always avoiding direct line of sight from above. The CIA called him the Pacer, believing he was Osama bin Laden himself. Despite the strong indications, there was no direct confirmation that bin Laden was inside. The US lacked high-resolution images or clear communication intercepts confirming his presence. The risk of acting on faulty intelligence was immense. Past operations had proven costly mistakes when targets turned out to be incorrect. As the SEALs stood by waiting for the final call, the White House Situation Room was a battlefield of its own. President Obama, flanked by key advisors, sat in tense silence. He'd been presented with multiple options, but this was the moment of no return. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, Defense Secretary Robert Gates, and CIA Director Leon Panetta each made their final recommendations. The intelligence was solid, but not 100% certain. There was no telling what the SEALs would encounter once inside. "We have one chance at this," Obama reportedly said. Obama's advisors debated the risks. What if bin Laden wasn't there? What if the mission resulted in the deaths of women and children? Could the SEALs escape Pakistani retaliation? All these questions weighed heavily on the room. After one final glance at the classified satellite feed, Obama turned to his military advisors. "Proceed," he said. "Execute the mission." Two specially modified Black Hawk stealth helicopters lifted off from a US base in Jalalabad, Afghanistan. Unlike standard helicopters, these aircraft were engineered for near-total radar evasion. Their tail rotors had been redesigned to significantly reduce noise, and their bodies were coated in radar-absorbing material. As they crossed into Pakistani airspace, there was an eerie silence over the radio. US surveillance drones monitored Pakistani radar stations in real time, prepared to alert the pilots if detection seemed imminent. Pilots flew at ultra-low altitude, hugging the valleys and avoiding direct flight paths that might expose them. The risk of mechanical failure was real. If one helicopter went down, the entire mission could be compromised. Every second in the air was a step closer to either success or disaster. Inside the helicopters, SEAL Team 6 members braced themselves. The mission had been rehearsed to perfection, but reality was unpredictable. They were trained for close-quarters combat, hostage scenarios and enemy resistance, but no simulation could prepare them for the unknown. For some, this was the culmination of years of sacrifice. They had missed holidays, birthdays, and countless hours with family to be here. Some SEALs clenched their fists around their weapons, replaying every tactical move in their minds. Others silently reflected on the magnitude of the mission. Their heart rates were steady, their breathing controlled. Years of experience had conditioned them to remain calm, even in the face of extreme danger. There was no room for fear now. Each operator knew their role. As they approached the compound, they had just minutes before Pakistan's air defense systems could react. The lead pilot whispered over comms, 2 minutes out. Stand by. Then the words that would go down in history, execute, execute. At that moment, SEAL Team 6 crossed the threshold into the unknown. The darkness of the Pakistani sky concealed their approach, but each operator was acutely aware of the dangers that lay ahead. Their minds replayed every drill, every scenario, every contingency plan. There was no room for doubt now. Failure was not an option. Every breath, every heartbeat synchronized with the mission ahead. Finally, after weeks of careful planning, simulations and intelligence verification, President Obama's order was being carried out. SEAL Team 6 would execute a covert nighttime raid. The world was about to witness history in the making. The two modified Black Hawk stealth helicopters cut through the darkness, flying just above the treetops to avoid detection by Pakistani radar. Their flight path had been meticulously planned to follow the contours of the landscape, minimizing their radar signature. The pilots, among the most skilled in the world, operated in near-complete silence, their communication limited to essential mission updates. As they neared their target, the Abbottabad compound loomed ahead, its high walls and barbed wire defences barely visible in the dim glow of moonlight. The SEALs, packed tightly inside the aircraft, felt the shift in atmosphere. This was the moment of no return. The lead helicopter, tasked with hovering above the main compound and deploying SEALs onto the roof, made its final approach. The second helicopter was to land in the courtyard, delivering additional operators to breach the ground floor. However, within seconds of descent, something went terribly wrong. As the first Black Hawk attempted to hover into position over the compound, a sudden loss of lift caused it to drop unexpectedly. The pilot reacted instantly, struggling to maintain control, but the aircraft's tail clipped the compound wall, sending it spiraling downward. Inside the helicopter, the SEALs braced for impact. The weight of their gear, night vision goggles, body armor, rifles and ammunition made them immobile as they prepared for a hard landing. With a deafening crash, The Black Hawk slammed into the ground inside the courtyard, throwing up a cloud of dust and debris. For a moment there was silence. Then years of training took over. The SEALs reacted with immediate precision, unstrapping themselves and rushing out of the downed aircraft, weapons raised. They had rehearsed for contingency failures, and now they had to improvise under extreme pressure. The second Black Hawk, realizing the situation, abandoned its original landing zone and repositioned outside the compound walls. The SEALs aboard disembarked and scaled the walls using ladders and explosives, determined to reach their teammates inside. As soon as the SEALs breached the main gates, the first resistance came from the compound's outer guards. The Taliban-trained security personnel, alerted by the crash, scrambled to respond. The SEALs moved with surgical precision, firing suppressed rounds as they advanced. Their weapons, HK-416 assault rifles equipped with suppressors and holographic sights, allowed them to eliminate threats with pinpoint accuracy. The courtyard was now clear. The team split into pre-planned assault units, each assigned a different section of the house. Their mission was clear: clear the building floor by floor until they reached bin Laden. The SEALs executed a methodical room-by-room sweep, clearing the ground floor first. The first encounter, a male combatant, later identified as bin Laden's courier, Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, rushed towards them with a weapon. The SEALs fired instantly, neutralizing the threat. Moving deeper, a second male, possibly al-Kuwaiti's brother, was eliminated in another room, attempting to grab a weapon. Civilians in the house. The SEALs encountered women and children who were detained but not harmed. Every movement was precise. This was not an indiscriminate assault, but a targeted elimination of hostile threats. The team advanced up the stairwell, now closing in on their ultimate target. The team leading the upstairs assault reached the third floor, where bin Laden was believed to be hiding. First challenge. The staircase leading to bin Laden's room was narrow and potentially booby-trapped. SEALs moved cautiously, weapons trained ahead. Encountering bin Laden's son, as they advanced, Khalid bin Laden, Osama's son, appeared at the top of the stairs, armed. The SEALs called out to him to surrender. Instead, he made a sudden move. He was shot and killed instantly. Final door breached. Now, the SEALs stood before the final room. They knew bin Laden was inside. With one final command, a SEAL stepped forward and whispered into his radio, "Target in sight." The SEALs stood at the threshold of the room where Osama bin Laden, the most wanted man in the world, had been hiding. The door was slightly ajar. They could hear muffled movement inside. Years of training had prepared them for this, but nothing could fully simulate coming face to face with history itself. A SEAL pushed the door open slightly wider, scanning the dimly lit room through the green glow of his night vision. Two women stood near the bed, shielding a tall figure. It was bin Laden. This was it. First shot fired. A SEAL raised his HK-416 rifle, placing a well-aimed shot into bin Laden's chest. Second shot fired. Another operator followed up, hitting him just above the left eye. Bin Laden collapsed onto the floor, a pool of blood forming around his head. His body convulsed slightly, then fell still. The room fell into a brief, eerie silence. His wives screamed in shock. One of them lunged at a SEAL, trying to attack him, but was restrained immediately. The team secured the room, ensuring no further threats remained. The most dangerous terrorist in modern history was dead. The SEALs moved quickly, knowing time was against them. First, they cleared the room. Women and children were separated from bin Laden's body. A SEAL radioed in. "For God and country, Geronimo, Geronimo, Geronimo." Command's response, "Roger, we have Geronimo." But confirmation was still required. One operator pulled out a handheld biometric scanner, a device used to instantly verify identities using facial recognition. They had trained with dozens of possible scenarios, but seeing bin Laden's face in real life still felt surreal. His height was checked, 6 feet 5 inches, just as expected. They also took photos of his face, some of which were later leaked online. Then came a crucial step: collecting intelligence. The SEALs knew they had a rare opportunity to uncover al-Qaeda's hidden networks. They raided bin Laden's personal files, laptops, hard drives, USB sticks and notebooks filled with names, locations and plans. One notebook contained cryptic messages, intelligence that would later reveal terrorist sleeper cells and active plots. Hard drives held years of correspondence, letters from bin Laden detailing his plans to continue targeting the West. It was a goldmine of intelligence, perhaps just as valuable as the strike itself. The Black Hawk wreckage still burned in the courtyard. Smoke curled into the night sky, an unmistakable signal that something was happening inside Abbottabad. The SEALs had two objectives: extract bin Laden's body and ensure the destroyed helicopter left no sensitive materials behind. A SEAL placed C4 explosives on the Black Hawk, setting a timed detonation. Within seconds of their departure, a massive fireball erupted, destroying the wreckage beyond recognition. With bin Laden's body secured, they rushed to the waiting Black Hawk. As they lifted off, radio transmissions suggested that Pakistani forces were mobilizing. Jets could be scrambled at any moment to intercept them. Would they make it out in time? The Black Hawk crossed the border into Afghanistan just as Pakistani radar began tracking unidentified movement in Abbottabad. They had made it. Osama bin Laden was dead. The world was about to change forever. They landed at Bagram Air Base, where bin Laden's body was photographed and examined by US officials. It was then transferred to an aircraft carrier in the Arabian Sea, where his body was buried at sea following Islamic traditions. Back in Washington, the Situation Room was silent as they awaited final confirmation. Then the words came: "Confirmed. Bin Laden is KIA." Obama exhaled and nodded. "We got him," he said simply. Hillary Clinton covered her mouth in shock. The room was filled with a sense of disbelief. Within hours, the president addressed the world. "Tonight, I can report to the American people and to the world that the United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of al-Qaeda." The world erupted in celebration and disbelief. Crowds gathered at the White House and Times Square chanting "USA, USA." World leaders reacted with some praising the US, while others raised concerns over the covert strike. Al-Qaeda vowed revenge, but the death of bin Laden marked the beginning of the end for the terrorist group's global dominance. The mission had lasted 40 minutes, but its impact would last forever. When SEAL Team 6 retrieved bin Laden's hard drives, notebooks and digital files, they uncovered one of the largest intelligence hauls in counterterrorism history. More than 470,000 files were recovered, including video messages bin Laden had recorded but never released. Letters between bin Laden and al-Qaeda leaders revealed his ongoing control over terrorist operations. Evidence of planned attacks, including targets in Europe and the US, showed al-Qaeda's continued ambitions. One of the most shocking discoveries was that bin Laden remained actively involved in al-Qaeda despite his isolation. US intelligence agencies had assumed he was merely a figurehead, but the files showed he was still strategizing attacks and issuing orders. His handwritten letters revealed frustration over al-Qaeda's failures. He worried that the group had become too focused on local insurgencies instead of global terrorism, and he was planning a restructuring of the organization. Among the most critical finds were detailed records of encrypted communications between bin Laden and al-Qaeda affiliates in Yemen, Somalia and Syria. US intelligence experts worked around the clock to decode messages, revealing potential operatives and hidden financial networks. Another major revelation was a training manual on how to avoid drone strikes, exposing how al-Qaeda had adapted to US military tactics. This information would prove invaluable for counterterrorism operations in the years to come. The death of Osama bin Laden was the biggest blow al-Qaeda had ever suffered. Within days, the group released a statement confirming bin Laden's death and vowing revenge. Ayman al-Zawahiri, bin Laden's second-in-command, was named the new leader, but he lacked bin Laden's charisma and influence. Al-Qaeda splintered, with regional branches acting more independently, weakening the group's central authority. Despite their threats, al-Qaeda struggled to mount any significant retaliation. US drone strikes intensified in the months following the raid, targeting top al-Qaeda figures across Afghanistan, Pakistan and Yemen. Zawahiri tried to reorganize the network, but his leadership was not well received. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, the most dangerous branch at the time, began to act independently. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which later became ISIS, distanced itself from Zawahiri's control. The power vacuum left by bin Laden's death led to the rise of other terrorist factions, particularly ISIS, which would later overshadow al-Qaeda. While al-Qaeda remained a threat, it would never regain the global presence it had under bin Laden. The US raid in Abbottabad created a major crisis for the Pakistani government. How did the world's most wanted terrorist live just miles from Pakistan's military academy? Why didn't Pakistani intelligence detect bin Laden? Did elements within the Pakistani government protect him? Pakistani leaders were publicly outraged that the US had conducted an unauthorized military operation inside their country. Pakistan's military was humiliated. They had failed to stop an incursion by US forces. Conspiracy theories spread. Some believed bin Laden was never actually there. Anti-American protests erupted, with many Pakistanis angered by the violation of their sovereignty. Behind closed doors, however, Pakistani officials scrambled to explain themselves. The fact that bin Laden had lived undetected in Abbottabad for years raised serious concerns about whether Pakistan had secretly harbored him. The Pakistani government launched an internal investigation to determine how bin Laden had managed to hide in plain sight. Several low-ranking intelligence officers were dismissed, but no high-level officials were held accountable. Public distrust in the Pakistani military skyrocketed, as many citizens believed their leaders were either incompetent or complicit. While the US never publicly accused Pakistan of sheltering bin Laden, the relationship between the two countries grew increasingly strained. For President Barack Obama, the successful mission was a defining moment of his presidency. He had made the call when others hesitated, proving his leadership in national security. His approval ratings soared, reaching their highest point in years. The raid became central to his 2012 re-election campaign, reinforcing his strength on foreign policy. During the 2012 presidential election, Obama's team frequently reminded voters that his administration had succeeded where others had failed. Osama bin Laden is dead and General Motors is alive. This became a key slogan for his campaign, contrasting his leadership with his opponent, Mitt Romney. While some critics argued that the mission was a team effort involving years of intelligence gathering, there was no doubt that Obama's decision to approve the risky operation had paid off politically. Bin Laden's death marked a turning point in the war on terror. But it did not mean the end of terrorism. Al-Qaeda weakened, but groups like ISIS rose in its place. The US intensified its use of drone strikes, targeting terrorist leaders worldwide. The intelligence from bin Laden's compound shaped counterterrorism strategies for years. Within months of the raid, the US carried out additional high-profile strikes, using intelligence gathered from bin Laden's compound. Counterterrorism forces adopted a new approach, focusing on smaller high-speed raids rather than full-scale wars. The Navy SEALs' success inspired new operational tactics used in later missions against ISIS and other terrorist factions. While bin Laden was dead, his ideology lived on. The next decade would see the rise of ISIS, a group that would overshadow Al-Qaeda in brutality and reach. The fight against global terrorism was far from over, but bin Laden's death was a clear message. No matter how long it takes, the US will find and eliminate its enemies. The death of Osama bin Laden was more than just the elimination of a terrorist leader. It was a symbolic victory for the United States and its allies in the war on terror. For nearly a decade, bin Laden had been the face of global jihad, responsible for thousands of deaths across multiple continents. His ability to evade capture for so long had made him larger than life, a figurehead for extremist movements worldwide. For the US and its allies, bin Laden's death represented justice for the victims of 9/11 and other attacks. For Al-Qaeda and extremist sympathizers, it was a devastating blow that shattered the image of bin Laden as an untouchable leader. For governments worldwide, it reaffirmed the United States' ability to strike anywhere, at any time, no matter how long it took. However, while bin Laden was dead, his ideology did not die with him. Al-Qaeda continued to exist, though fractured and weakened, and new extremist groups, particularly ISIS, would emerge to take its place. The question remained, did the death of bin Laden truly change the course of the war on terror, or was it simply another chapter in an ongoing battle? The death of bin Laden accelerated the decline of Al-Qaeda, but it did not mean the end of global terrorism. Ayman al-Zawahiri, bin Laden's successor, struggled to keep Al-Qaeda together. Al-Qaeda's regional branches, particularly in Yemen and North Africa, began acting independently. By 2014, a new extremist group emerged, ISIS. While Al-Qaeda had focused on coordinated attacks on Western targets, ISIS took a different approach, establishing a physical caliphate in Iraq and Syria. Unlike Al-Qaeda, ISIS controlled territory and ruled through brutal enforcement of Sharia law. While bin Laden had been the mastermind behind distant attacks, ISIS called for mass killings worldwide, using social media as a recruitment tool. The US had spent over a decade hunting bin Laden, but within a few years, ISIS had grown into an even greater threat. Some analysts believe that had bin Laden survived longer, he might have tried to prevent ISIS from rising, seeing it as a reckless and uncontrollable movement. Instead, his death allowed a new wave of extremism to flourish in an even deadlier form. The success of Operation Neptune Spear shifted US military strategy in profound ways. Prior to the bin Laden raid, the war on terror had been dominated by large-scale military interventions. The invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, with thousands of US troops stationed in foreign lands. The bin Laden raid proved that special operations forces could achieve high-value targets more efficiently than full-scale wars. It set the stage for a new era of counterterrorism, one based on surgical strikes, intelligence-driven missions, and small elite forces. Drone warfare and targeted operations became the preferred strategy, reducing the need for prolonged military occupations. After 2011, the US increasingly relied on special operations missions, including the 2012 raid on al-Qaeda leader Abu Yahya al-Libi, the 2015 US Special Forces mission that killed ISIS leader Abu Sayyaf in Syria, the 2019 raid that resulted in the death of ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. These operations followed the blueprint of the bin Laden raid: covert intelligence gathering, elite forces, and rapid execution with minimal risk to civilian populations. While the world largely celebrated bin Laden's death, there was an ongoing debate about whether the raid was an act of justice or an extrajudicial execution. Supporters of the mission argued that bin Laden had declared war on the US and was responsible for thousands of deaths. His refusal to surrender justified the lethal force used against him. Critics pointed out that bin Laden was unarmed at the time of his death, and some believed he could have been captured alive and put on trial, similar to Saddam Hussein's capture in 2003. The legal justification for the mission was based on the 2001 Authorization for Use of Military Force, which granted the president broad authority to target those responsible for 9/11. However, some legal scholars argued that the US bypassed international law by carrying out the raid without Pakistan's consent. Regardless of the legal debates, the world moved forward, accepting bin Laden's death as a necessary conclusion to his reign of terror. The bin Laden raid quickly became one of the most significant military operations in modern history. In the US, it was seen as a moment of unity, with Americans from all political backgrounds celebrating the victory. For counter-terrorism agencies, it was a case study in intelligence gathering, special operations, and mission execution. For al-Qaeda and its sympathizers, it was a humiliating defeat, shattering the idea that bin Laden was untouchable. Bin Laden's legacy, however, remains complex. To some, he is remembered as the most dangerous terrorist in modern history, responsible for atrocities that changed global security forever. To others, particularly in extremist circles, he remains a martyr, whose death only fueled future generations of jihadists. For historians, his death marked the end of one era of terrorism, but not the end of terrorism itself. Today, over a decade after his death, bin Laden's influence has faded, but his actions continue to shape global security policies. The night of May 1st, 2011, was a turning point in history. SEAL Team 6 had accomplished what millions thought was impossible, tracking down and eliminating the world's most wanted terrorist. But did his death truly change the world? Al-Qaeda never fully recovered, but new terrorist groups emerged in its place. The war on terror evolved, shifting to intelligence-driven special operations instead of full-scale wars. For the victims of 9/11, the raid provided long-awaited justice, but the scars of that day remain. As the world moves forward, one thing is clear: the hunt for bin Laden was never just about one man. It was about sending a message to those who attack innocent people that justice may take time, but it will come. And on that night in Abbottabad, justice arrived in the form of a team of silent warriors, moving through the darkness, completing a mission that would be remembered forever.